Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Sarah Bueno, and I'm delighted to have you join us today. The NARM Training Institute is offering a Level 2 NARM therapist training online so that you can attend from anywhere. The trauma field is evolving so quickly. Trauma-informed therapists who want to learn how to address the long-term impacts of adverse childhood experiences and complex post-traumatic stress disorder want to be trained in NARM. This online NARM therapist training is starting in April 2021 and July 2021, and they're filling up fast. So if you're interested, we'd encourage you to register now to reserve your spot. For more information and to register, please visit www.narmtraining.com/level2online. We look forward to you joining our growing international NARM community and are inspired to work with you to bring NARM to your clients and communities in order to transform trauma. I'm very excited to share today's guest with you. Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett is among the top 1% most cited scientists in the world for her revolutionary research in psychology and neuroscience. She is a university distinguished professor of psychology at Northeastern University, with appointments at Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital. Dr. Barrett has published over 240 peer-reviewed scientific papers, appearing in Science, Nature Neuroscience, and other top journals in psychology and cognitive neuroscience, as well as 6 academic volumes published by Guilford Press. So please enjoy our interview with Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett. Hello, Dr. Barrett. Welcome to Transforming Trauma.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
Yeah, we're very excited. So I'd love to ask you the question that we ask all of our guests on Transforming Trauma, and it's a way that we actually open NARM sessions with clients and asking, what is it that you want people to get out of our time together today?
I guess that it's really helpful to know something about how your brain works, that science and philosophy are accessible to people, and they really are tools for living a better life. If you had a recipe and you wanted to make it taste better, it would be really good if you knew actually all the ingredients and how they were put together, rather than just being able to put a little bit of salt or butter on the final product, right? And that's kind of the goal in teaching people a little bit about neuroscience. It's fun. You can entertain your friends. You can feel a little smarter, and it actually helps.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Well, how about you give us a more robust introduction to who you are and what your work is, really?
Well, I started off as a clinical psychologist. I did my PhD in clinical psychology, and I retrained in physiology and in neuroscience and various types of neuroscience. I started off studying emotions, what they are, how they work, what is your brain doing in conversation with your body and the rest of the world to create emotions. And that really led me to ask much more basic questions about, like, why do we even have a brain? What's it good for? It's a pretty expensive organ. Actually, it's the most expensive organ we have in our that 3-pound blob of meat between your ears is like 20% of your metabolic budget. So it's like really expensive. So what's it good for? And I don't know, just it led me to start really thinking about the neurobiological basis of mental and physical health and how they really are two sides of the same coin, not in some mystical way, but in a very real biological way. And just how does that work exactly?
Wonderful. Yes, let's dig into that. So, and you just recently released a book.
I did. So my first foray into publishing for the general audience, which in my house, we refer to non-scientists as civilians. That's so. My first book, How Emotions Are Made, The Secret Life of the Brain, was a pretty standard popular science book. It's, about 300 pages. It has literally, I think, 1,000 references plus more on the web. It's accessible, but it's a standard popular science book. It has a lot of details about the science, cool details, but details nonetheless. And then I thought it would be really interesting to write a book of essays that were really distilled little stories about how the brain works and maybe invite people to think about how you could use these little neuroscience nuggets to live a different life, a better life, or maybe be happy with the life that you have, but really just to think about what it means to be human and what kind of a human you really want to be. And so this book, which is called 7.5 Lessons About the Brain, it's a small book of little essays. My husband calls it the first neuroscience beach read. That, each essay is like an hour, maybe at most, if that. It's meant to be compact, and there's an appendix. It's a little bit like a choose your own adventure that you could just read the essays, or there's also an appendix that goes into more detail about particular scientific topics, gives credit to other scientists whose turn of phrase I might have borrowed. And then there's a full website full of references for every scientific point that's made in the book. So anyone who wants to do a deep dive into the science can actually find little breadcrumbs on this website to take them to the broader literature on that topic.
It's brilliant. I love how accessible it is. And even in just the way that we're talking, I can tell like the metaphors you use, the storytelling in it, just I feel like will make it really an easy read. Like that seems kind of silly to make a science book, a beach read, but that's exactly right. It's just so accessible. And that's one of the aims we have on this podcast, to try to make healing from trauma feel more accessible for people too.
Yeah, well, I guess this is a common goal, I think, that science is a set of tools for living. And you don't have to be credentialed scientist with a white coat, and you don't have to speak in code, and you don't have to use a lot of statistics. Really, science is a frame of mind. It's a willingness to treat your deeply held beliefs as hypotheses, try to make observations to compare to your hypotheses, and a willingness to give up your hypotheses or modify them if the data turn out to, not even. So in principle, you have to be responsive to the data, even if you don't like it, even if it doesn't feel intuitive to you. I think these are the principles of science that make it a really set of handy tools. And the results that you get from being a scientist can really, I think, help you be more of an architect of your own experience.
I'm really excited to hear you describe science in that way, because it's so aligned with the principles of NARM. So I don't know how much you are familiar with NARM, the Neuroaffective Relational Model, and the NARM Institute is sponsoring this podcast. And that's how we approach every session with a client. Is the teacher, Brad Kammer, talks literally about the working hypothesis, that we're sort of kind of holding an idea lightly in the back of our head and asking questions, getting data. And then I literally said this to one of my staff members today. Sometimes we have to abandon a hypothesis when we find out new information. So it's quite aligned.
Yeah. And in fact, what I would say is that we're not even holding a hypothesis lightly. Your brain is wired to the world that you grew up in and that you have had experiences with. And scientists sometimes say we run an internal model of the world in our brains. I would say we run a model of our bodies in the world, because your brain's really, its most important job is to regulate the systems of your body in the world, right? To make sure that you stay healthy and alive and well. But what's really interesting is that a scientist or a brain, that isn't responsive to the data, isn't responsive to the evidence, it's not really hypothesis testing, that person is living an ideology. And ideologies are dangerous things. They're dangerous things politically, and they're also dangerous things for your mental health, frankly, for your physical health. A brain really needs to be responsive to the data. And when it isn't, of course, we should have compassion when that happens in the real world. For a scientist, actually, with a white lab coat, if they're not responsive to the data, it's debatable, actually, whether you should have compassion for that person, but in their role as a scientist. But for when a brain is insensitive to the sense data that it's receiving from the world and from the body, that usually means that, there's a problem there, a challenge there that has to be addressed. And it has to be addressed with, with care and compassion, but it has to be addressed.
Well, one of the things we're pretty aligned also with Gabor Mate and his research on trauma. And one of the things that he says is trauma is a normal response to an abnormal situation. I just hear a lot of similarity in what you're saying there, that if we are responding to what's happening around us in a way that doesn't match, well, in your book, actually, you said it's based off of old things that have happened, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the way to think about it is that when a baby is born, that baby is born with a brain under construction. The
Mm-hmm.
brain isn't finished, not even by a long shot. And the brain is waiting for wiring instructions from the world, the sights and sounds and smells of the world, but also the social world. That is eye contact and cuddling and singing and words and so on. And all of these things actually wires a baby's brain for, give or take approximately 25 years. And that kind of neural change, wiring yourself to the world, doesn't ever stop. It continues throughout your entire life. That's what scientists call plasticity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it might proceed more slowly, but it's fundamentally the same kind of process.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really important to say that, the current views of the brain that have been with us for a really long time, the idea that we have a big cerebral cortex, which is its job is to keep us rational, and that we have this like inner beast of a limbic system for emotion and, a lizard brain for instincts, and that our minds are this constant battle between our inner beast and our rational side. This idea makes some intuitive sense to people. It's really a model of morality and mental health, but it actually bears no resemblance at all to the actual evolution of the brain or its structure or its function. So no one on this planet has a lizard brain except a lizard. And really what's happening in your brain is something really different. And just to echo this idea that trauma is a normal response to abnormal stimuli, what I would say is that if you understand a little bit about how the brain works, then you understand, I think, rationality in a really different way. Rationality is not the absence of emotion. It's not the absence of feeling. Your brain isn't wired in a way that you can ever have an absence of feeling unless you have something wrong with your brain wiring. So no neurotypical brain has an absence of feeling ever, actually. But rationality is really your brain spending resources when it believes they're necessary. So in my book, I explain all of this, and I explain that, your brain's most important job is running a budget for your body. And you can think about your whole life really in terms of these like withdrawals and deposits into this body budget. And so a traumatic response to adversity, you can use this way of understanding the brain to change your understanding of rationality so that a traumatic response to adversity really is quite rational, actually.
Right.
The brain believes that a big expenditure of energy is necessary to protect the organism, you, from threat. And it expends that energy. And even in a situation where there may not be actual veridical threat, your brain, it's making its best guess. That guess might be wrong, but that doesn't make it an irrational response. It's very rational from the internal logic of the brain, I guess is what I would say. And, brains require quite a bit of energy to change the internal model, to learn something new about the environment. And a failure to learn, a failure for your brain to update its internal model when the environment changes and the threat goes away is also not a lack of rational response. Because if you are metabolically encumbered, if your body budget is running a deficit, it's actually very rational not to spend the energy to learn. And when I say spend the energy, I don't mean metaphorically. I mean, the two most expensive things your brain can do is move your body and learn something new. So if you're sleep deprived, if you aren't eating healthfully, if you're dealing with constant strain and stress, it's very likely that your body budget will be running a deficit, in which case it's going to be harder for your brain to update and adjust its internal model to match the current circumstances. That's not irrational. That's actually really rational.
Right. And what I hear on the other side of that is if we recognize that that's how our brain works, we can be so much more compassionate with ourselves, right? Like I see so many things on social media right now saying like, hey, like it's okay if you can't, go exercise all the time and you're not eating healthy. We're in a pandemic. Like
For sure.
we're spending a lot of our body's energy, right? Like just surviving right now.
For sure. Yeah. You don't want to beat yourself up with but I think a couple of things are important to realize. One is that if you're not sleeping well and you're not exercising on a regular basis and you're not eating healthfully, there is a metabolic price to pay for that. Mm-hmm. And you don't have to beat yourself up with it, but you do have to actually realize it, because what it means is that you're not going to use my daughter's phrase, you're just not going to have the spoons to pay attention as well, or to learn new things, or to, and so on and so forth. So you just have to kind of give yourself a break. But realize the consequences, not in a blameful way, but just realize the consequences of running a deficit in your body budget. And the other thing I just want to say, and I want to make this really clear, and I try really hard to make this really clear every time I talk about this. Your brain is running a budget for your body. That's its most important job. Your brain didn't evolve to think and feel and see. And, it evolved to control your body. Mm-hmm. And it does all those other things in the service of that. It doesn't feel to us that way. Every joy we feel, every insult we bear, every hug we give or receive, we don't experience this in metabolic terms, but that's actually what's happening under the hood. And anything that you can do to make it easier for your brain to regulate your body is going to make it easier for you to deal with your life. Mm-hmm. And anything which causes your body budget to run towards a deficit, it's going to make you feel bad. It's going to make it harder for you to deal with the slings and arrows that life, throws your way. Sometimes people misunderstand me to say that, you could cure depression or anxiety or PTSD just by eating healthfully and sleeping well. And I'm not at all saying
not that black and white.
No, and I certainly would never suggest it. But I think it's important to understand that your brain is a complex system. There are lots and lots and lots and lots of little nudges and lots of causes which interact with each other to influence the physical state that you're in. And so this whole discussion of body budgeting is just one influence that's important. It's not the only one, but it's one that's often overlooked, which is why I'm emphasizing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. And I want to go back and be very, very clear with listeners about what you said in terms of there not being three different parts of the brain, right? In a lot of somatic therapies, we talk about the triune brain all the time. And literally in your book, you're like, that is the biggest myth in science that we've ever had. And so I want to say that very plainly so that listeners hear that. And if there's anything more you'd like to add on that, because I just think about how that's going to change the way we teach about trauma, the way that we teach about addiction, how we understand these things. So anything you'd like to expand on with that?
Yeah, there's so much to say about this.
Right.
And I mean, I will say that the triune brain, it's intuitive, at least to people from Western cultures, it's intuitive. It's a very Western notion.
Right.
And you can trace it all the way back to ancient Greece. And it really is a description actually of human morality. That your instincts and emotions are always in constant combat, constant struggle with your rational side for control of your behavior. And this is the myth, right? When rationality wins, you are righteous, you are moral, and you are healthy. And when, your inner beast wins, that means that you're either immoral because you didn't try hard enough, or you're sick because you weren't able to tame your inner beast. And that morality play was basically tattooed onto the brain in the 20th century as scientists were attempting to understand the differences between the brain structure of different animals. But the brain didn't evolve in layers. Sometimes, I think of it as, the model of the brain as an already baked cake. You've got this inner lizard, and on top of that, you have a limbic system, limbic meaning border. So the regions of the brain that border the lizard brain, that's supposed to be the home of emotion. And then that's the already baked cake, right? And then on top of that, evolution is supposed to have produced a big cerebral cortex, which is where rationality lives.
Mm-hmm.
And the brain didn't evolve that way. And that's not my discovery. That's been known since the 1970s. It's actually really ironic that when this model of the brain became super popular in the 1970s in a book by Carl Sagan called The Dragons of Eden, which won a Pulitzer Prize, that was around the time when the research was being done to show this is actually not how brains have evolved at all. It's not how they function. And in fact, every mammalian brain that's ever been studied comes from the same manufacturing plan. This is what scientists have discovered by peering into the molecular structure of the genes inside cells. So, your brain structure is very similar to, it's actually the plan of your brain is exactly the same as a rat or a dog or a cat. And the genetics suggests that we even share a very, very similar brain plan to every vertebrate on this planet. So, your brain plan is very similar to, a blood-sucking lamprey or a bird, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what that means is our understanding of what makes someone healthy and what makes someone struggle, and our understanding of what rationality really is and what emotion is just completely different than a scientifically driven understanding, is really different from this somewhat intuitive, but very, very, very mythical triune brain.
Well, and the way that you describe the evolution of the triune brain, it's very linear. And the whole rationality thing, I don't know if you're nodding to this, but it feels like patriarchy.
Well, honey,
I don't know if you're nodding to this, but it feels like
that. There's a whole literature actually in anthropology, particularly in anthropology. You can see it in psychology too, and somewhat in sociology, but really in anthropology, very gendered discussion of emotion and rationality, and a lot of popular discussion of brains, like the female brain, the male brain, all of that. It's just, yeah. I mean, there are some recent books that have come out, I don't want to name names, but there are many different books on the brain that you can read. Anytime you read anything about sex differences in the brain, you really should come back and read my book.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody who reads anything about how male and female brains are really different should go and read books by Cornelia Fine, who I think has done a fantastic job at debunking those myths. And I also touch on them to some extent in How Emotions Are Made, but it's not a joke to say that this particular view of the brain does tend to have embedded in it a particular view of gender and a particular view of differences in culture and ethnicity that many scholars would question.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So when somebody experiences trauma, I guess the question is, if we are throwing the triune brain out the window, what is happening? And I guess I'd love to frame this from more of a developmental trauma perspective, because that's really what we focus on in NARM. So I know you talk in the book about infants, and like you said before, we're wired to respond to our environment and connection with others. So when an infant is, let's say, in a home where there's just emotional neglect, what is happening in the brain?
Yeah, so I think I want to take even one step back further and say, okay, your brain's most important job is to run a budget for your body. When an infant is born, an infant cannot manage its own nervous system on its own. It can't even birth by itself. It has to learn how to sleep. It has to learn how to nurse. It has to learn how to do all kinds of things. So caregivers must maintain the body budget of that infant. That's what you're doing. That's what you're doing when you feed the baby. That's what you're doing when you help the baby to learn to go to sleep. That's what you're doing when you cuddle the baby. That's what you're doing when you talk to the baby, when you make eye contact with the baby. All of these things actually are helping to wire the baby's brain so that eventually she can take over the main burden of running her body budget. But that happens over like a 20-year period, right? So the thing to remember is that if a child at any age, actually, but the younger it happens, the worse it is, any child experiences neglect, meaning that there's a parent who's not responsive, And again, I don't want to, I don't mean that you have to you don't have to be a slave to your kids. Being responsive doesn't mean doing every single thing they nag you to do.
Good enough mother.
Good enough mother, sure, or father, right?
Right.
But if you're neglectful to the basic needs of an infant or young child, the baby's brain will wire itself to the environment that it's given. It just will. And that means that the baby's brain is wiring itself in a way that starts to pay a metabolic tax right off the bat. These taxes are little, but they add up over time, which is why when you have kids who have experienced adversity of any sort, there's a parametric relationship between the number of adverse events and the likelihood of illness later in life. And most of those illnesses, if not all of them, have a metabolic basis. Depression is a metabolic illness. It's not only a metabolic illness, but it is at its basis a metabolic illness. The reason why you have immune dysfunction and you have negative mood and you have movement disorder and you have concentration problems can all be understood, at least in part, to a problem with body budgeting. And I'm not reducing depression to body budgeting. I'm just saying this is one. What is serotonin? Serotonin, a lot of people who are depressed, who experience depression, take serotonin uptake inhibitors. That leaves more serotonin around for neurons to use. What is serotonin? It's a metabolic regulator. What is dopamine? It's a metabolic regulator. What are opioids? They are metabolic regulators. So they're not only that, but that is actually how they evolved. They evolved to contribute to metabolism. So it's very, very serious. And actually, if infants or young children are neglected for long periods of time, after a certain point, their brains actually will not be resilient to change. So there are, sensitive periods, and some people think they're really critical periods for brain development that once those windows close, they're closed, unless there's some, chemical modification to open them up again. And what's really interesting about this is that just feeding and watering your kids, right, making sure they're fed and clothed isn't sufficient for normal brain development. That humans require social contact. They require social care. Even something like what seems to us as simple as how often you make eye contact and are you following the kid's eyes or is she following yours? Even things like that actually end up having a really big impact on brain wiring. So I think the moral of this story is that we always knew that how we treated our kids was important, but it's much more important than we knew before. It doesn't mean that you have to be a perfect parent. Nobody's a perfect parent. All of us screw up as parents. It's how could you not, right? But, if you're responsive, if you love your children and you provide them a safe environment, their occasional disruptions of their body budget's not going to be a problem. It's really the persistent neglect or actually outright abuse where it's the person who's supposed to be managing your body budget for you is the one who's making massive withdrawals, even if that person then makes deposits.
Right.
And I can explain more about why this is the case, but it makes it difficult for that child's brain to predict, which has a metabolic cost to it.
Right. Well, and one of the things that we really talk a lot about in NARM is doing our own work, right? Working on our own trauma. And that's what I found in working with parents is, they say, well, how do I not screw up my kid? Well, do your own work, right? If you can't balance your body brain budget, then I'm sure you're not going to be able to help your kid very well, right?
Yeah. And I think the other thing to remember too is that, we're also, even as adults, we are the caretakers of each other's nervous systems. So, we metaphorically speaking, make deposits and withdrawals into each other's body budgets all the time. So you aren't the sole owner of your body budget. Other people can make deposits or withdrawals. The best thing for a human nervous system is another human. The worst thing for a human nervous system is also another human. So
there's the good news and the bad news.
Yeah, exactly. So, one way of taking care of yourself is to surround yourself with people who allow you to be your best self.
Yes. Yes. Right. And as you were saying, being with other people is one of the best things you can do. And from a NARM perspective, we really talk a lot about agency. And we as adults have agency to make choices about who we're around, whereas children, we don't have that choice. And we have to be around people that might be, like you said, withdrawing from our budget all the time.
Yeah. So you as a caregiver are curating the environment that is being wired into the brains of your children, essentially.
I really like that.
That's an awesome responsibility. And I'm using that word not only in its slang version, but actually in its traditional meaning. It's a incredible responsibility. And, from my personal perspective, I'll say that while I was in complete control of my daughter's environment, I felt like that was easier, actually. I'm not saying she never threw a tantrum or that she never cried or she never, managing a child's body budget doesn't mean they're happy all the time. It doesn't mean that they never struggle. It means that you're setting up a context where they can spend and then the deficit is replenished, right? And if you're doing your job, then you're leaving sort of extra resources left over for them to play and make mistakes and burn some of their resources as long as it's replenished. But then once they're out of your care, much of the time when they're in school, particularly when they go to middle school or high school, it's much harder as a parent because you only have limited control over the environment that is being curated. And your child doesn't have complete control either. And that's, for me, personally, where things got really tricky. It's really, really hard when you have primary responsibility for the well-being of someone whose environment you actually don't have 100% control over.
And again, enter pandemic, right? Like a lot of parents, I'm sure, are really, all humans are struggling right now with how to balance our budgets, right? And then to have to care for your children. Of course, many people, while they're trying to work, it's too much.
It is. And people are struggling and we're all struggling. When people ask me how I am, at first I was saying, well, do you want reality or do you just want me to be socially appropriate? Like, am I supposed to say, oh, I'm just fine? Or do you actually, are you really asking me? And now when people ask me, I just say, hanging in. Like, that's the best I can do, and to be honest.
Right.
But I think it's important for people to realize too, that kids are pretty resilient. Like, they really are. If the basis is there, right? If they have someone they can trust, what does that mean to have a secure base, to have somebody that you trust? It means that somebody's managing your body budget, or at least they're making major deposits and to some extent curating when those big expenditures come. So even if your kid can't go to school or, is watching TV too much, or you have to work at times, there's no necessary reason to assume that because you can't attend to your child every, minute of the day, that somehow that's a form of neglect. There's just no evidence for that. And in fact, there is evidence to suggest that even children who experience tremendous adversity do much better when they have one person, right, who they love and trust and who loves them. And why is that? Because that person is managing their body budgets in some way. So, I think the issue here really is persistent neglect or harm. That's really where things get dire. And, that's what the evidence shows. So one major horrible trauma in childhood is bad, but it's not as bad as persistent neglect or harm.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to switch topics just a little bit because there's some questions I told you that our NARM community was really interested in seeing what your thoughts were on them. And one of them is, how do you define internal states and how that relates with the emotions that we're feeling?
Right. So my way of doing it is really rooted in anatomy. And the distinctions that I make, I think, are in my book, How Emotions Are Made. I go into the data for those distinctions. They're a little bit different than the way that those words get used in everyday life. But, here's how I would describe it. Your brain is always running a budget for your body. Your body's always sending sense data back to your brain. You can't feel those sense data. You're not wired to feel them. Right now, Sarah, you and I are sitting here having a chat, and both of us are completely unaware, I think, that there's like a major drama going on in each of us right now, right? Like a whole symphony is going on inside me and inside you. And largely speaking, we can't really feel it very directly. Even when we're sick, like with appendicitis, you don't really feel the pain very directly until right before your appendix bursts, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're really not wired to experience all the sense data. Instead, evolution has fashioned us with kind of a really general barometer. It's like, I feel good, I feel bad, I feel really worked up, I feel really tranquil. These are really simple feelings that come from body budgeting. And they're with you always, your whole life. Every waking moment of your life, you have these feelings. They are properties of consciousness, and they are not emotions. Now, they are features of emotion, like when your brain constructs them into an emotion, they're a part of an emotion, but they also are with you in moments where your brain is not constructing emotion, constructing a thought or constructing a perception or, making a decision.
Can I break that down a little bit just to see if I understand? So if I'm experiencing for lack of a better term, I guess, like sensations of my inner state being chaotic, then I might perceive that I might either think I'm feeling anxiety because of what's going on internally.
Yeah. So here's what your brain does. When your body budget is flush, you feel pretty good. When your body budget's running a deficit, even temporarily, you feel pretty bad. Like, think about exercising. You're into it for about 10 minutes. And I don't know about you, but after about 10 minutes, I'm ready to be done. Like, I just want to quit. But I don't quit, but I want to. And it's because I'm running a deficit. I'm making an expenditure. Now, that expenditure is like a really good investment. I'm going to get a return on that investment in the future, and I'll make sure to replenish my water and, sleep well and blah, blah. But the point is that in the moment, there's a deficit and it doesn't feel good. In everyday life, the way your brain works is kind of like it has to try to make sense of the sense data that it's receiving from the body and from the world. So when you feel bad, your brain doesn't know why. What it's going to do is it's going to try to explain those feelings, which, scientists like me would call affect, or we could just call it mood. But those simple feelings that are always with you, that are part of consciousness, part of your conscious life, your brain's going to try to explain, where do those come from? What does that mean? And sometimes your brain explains them as emotions. So an emotion is really a story that your brain is telling itself about the cause of the internal sensations in relation to what's going on around you in the world. But those internal sensations, which give you affect, can also be part of perceptions, right? So when someone cuts me off on the highway, when I used to drive before COVID,
right,
the experience I would have of that person was that they were an utter right? And this was like part of their essence or something, And that is me experiencing affect, not as a property of my reaction to the world, but as a property of that person, of that object. So when we say that's a delicious drink, that's a beautiful painting, that's a nice person, those are all examples of your brain constructing experiences where your affect is embedded as a property of the object, of the person, not as your reaction.
Right.
Part of therapy often is understanding that, no, the guy who cut you off isn't an maybe he was rushing to the hospital to see his kid. Maybe he was late to pick up his mother who had a really important doctor's appointment or something. When you feel bad, it isn't necessarily an indication that something is wrong in the world.
Right.
But it's important to understand that it's not evidence that you are flawed or sick in some way if that's how you experience it sometimes. The way that animals evolved to be able to move first and to have internal systems that coordinated with each other. The first animals on this planet didn't have eyes and ears and noses, and they didn't have, senses of the outside world. Their way of sensing the outside world was when something perturbed the animal, its internal coordination would be perturbed. So It doesn't tell you what is perturbing you. It doesn't tell you what is wrong in the world. It just tells you, ooh, something happened that's relevant. That's a little bit how you can think of your affective feelings. They're telling you something about your body budget. They're not telling you why. They're just telling you that something's up. And then you have to figure it out. Your brain's first guess isn't always its best guess.
Right. Thank you. The other question that I really want to get to, I feel like I need to set it up a little bit to kind of explain like something that we talk about in NARM. So essentially, I know I'm going to stumble over this because it's kind of a complex thing, but we talk about identifications and disidentifications. So very simply, like if I'm like, well, I'm an Aquarius, so I'm super eccentric, then I'm identified with being an Aquarius. And that's a very silly example. But in NARM, the hope is that as we kind of observe what is and how we are repeating our own trauma to ourselves by pressuring ourselves and shaming ourselves and hating ourselves and that sort of thing, as we come to the other side of that, we often then disidentify with things that we thought we were. And that process of disidentification creates something is happening in the brain. So trying to think of an example. One of the things I'm working through is with my parents, there was always kind of this very fine line to walk that, you know, they wanted me to do things to make them proud of me, but at the same time, don't be too big because that's an offense and then you're full of yourself, right? So there's this very fine line. And in therapy, as I've been able to step out of that bind, what literally happens, I'll be sitting with my therapist and I'll just kind of like stare off into space and she'll be like, what's happening right now? And I'm like, I don't even know. And it's this very fuzzy kind of foggy feeling. And my guess has always been that that's the neuroplasticity, like that's the learning new things. And like in that instant, I'm like learning something new and experiencing it in real time. But this is the number one question from the NARM community. Like, what is that?
Yeah, I think that's a hard question to answer, and I'm not sure that scientists really know. And I'm also not sure that it's one thing, frankly.
Okay, yeah.
But let me back up and say the neurotypical way that a brain works is it's not reacting to things in the world. We sort of use that language, but it's not like your brain sits dormant and then is stimulated and then you react. That's not how your brain is structured. Your brain didn't evolve that way. That would be a really metabolically inefficient brain. There are some brains that work that way, particularly people who are struggling on the spectrum, you know, and I'm talking about people who are really struggling. You know, there are some aspects of being non-neurotypical that are wonderful that people have written about and talked about. And so I'm not pathologizing, but there is also research to show that people on the spectrum, their brains don't predict as well. And that's what I'm going to be talking about here, that really their brains are a little more reactive and a little less predictive. And that makes life hard, actually.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense.
So what your brain is really doing, actually, is it's always guessing, always predicting. You've got this internal model. And so when sense data come from your eyes and your ears and your nose and from internal, you know, parts of your body, your brain is receiving this sense data, but it's trapped in a dark, silent box called your skull. So it's receiving the effects, the outcomes. It's receiving the outcomes of some set of causes. And it doesn't know what the causes are because it only has access to the effects. So when you hear a loud bang, what is it? What could it be? Is it a car backfiring? Did somebody slam a door? Is it a gunshot? When you feel an ache in your stomach or in your chest, what is it? Is it anxiety? Is it longing? Are you hungry? Like, what is it? And so your brain has to guess the answer, and it guesses the answer with your past experience. That's what your internal model is. Your brain is using your past experience, and your brain is asking itself, figuratively speaking, the last time I was in this situation where I was in this physical state, what did I do next? What did I see next? What did I feel next? What did I hear next? And it starts to actually prepare to change the firing of its own neurons to prepare to have those experiences.
Right.
And it's doing the whole thing predictively. That's the really challenging part. So when you see something or hear something or feel something, it's because your brain was already preparing itself for you to hear or see or feel that. And the sense data, all the sense data do are confirm the prediction or change it, which is learning, right? Learning is changing. So if you're running on autopilot, it means that your brain is predicting and the sense data are confirming and you're just going along on autopilot. But when you shift your attention to something new deliberately, like when you're mindful or when you're in a therapy session and your therapist draws your attention to something new, you've just broken the chain of automatic prediction.
That's exactly what's happening. Yeah.
And that can sometimes feel disorienting. And in fact, when I'm giving public talks, I sometimes use some examples and I explain that when your brain cannot predict at all, your brain has this amazing capacity. It's called conceptual combination. So even if you've never experienced something in the past, like you and I never met before today, but we expect certain things from each other because we have past experiences that are similar to this. Even though we've never actually experienced each other in this way,
right.
We have experiences that are similar. And so our brains can use bits and pieces of the past to make predictions about the immediate future, which becomes your present. But when your brain can't do that for some reason, you are experientially blind. It's like hearing a language that you can't understand. You just hear noise because your brain doesn't have the past experience to make sense of those sounds into phonemes and words. Or when you hear music from a culture that is very different, with a very different scale, it just sounds like noise, right? So in these moments of fog, it's really, you've sort of interrupted the kind of automatic flow of prediction. And those are moments of great opportunity. Even though they also might be moments of great arousal. And when I'm using that word very specifically, I don't mean sexual arousal. I mean, the traditional thing would be to say great moments of great anxiety. But anxiety is just a way that your brain is making sense of high arousal that feels unpleasant. And anxiety might not be the right concept to use to make sense of those sensations. It's our go-to concept. In our house, we try really hard to make a distinction between uncertainty due to an inability to predict and anxiety.
Yeah.
So, because you do something different in those cases.
Right.
And that's the meaningful thing. It's like, what path are you taking yourself along as you act? When your brain makes a prediction, the prediction is a motor prediction first. Your brain is preparing to change your body, the internal systems of your body, and your movements. And what you experience of the world is a consequence of that. So it's not that you experience the world, evaluate it in some way, and then act. It's that your brain, based on this moment, is associating, predicting how to act in the next moment. And what you experience is the result of that. And so it's important to consider other ways of acting. One important lesson here is that who you are in this moment is somewhat conditioned on your past. You can't go back into your past and change it very easily. I mean, that's what one of the things that therapy is supposed to do. It's supposed to help you do that. But we all know that works sometimes better than others. But here's what you can do. You can make an effort, you can invest to curate different experiences for yourself today. And that is basically what you're doing when you do that. Is you're curating your past.
Right.
The future, you have more choices, you have more options, you have more control over who you will be in the future.
That's exactly what happens in NARM, because as we're looking at and potentially changing the way that we relate to ourselves and relate to our past, yes, it gives us more choices. That's, totally aligned. Wonderful. Well, this has just been so awesome. I'm really excited to finish your book. I didn't get to read the whole thing yet. And I really highly encourage listeners to read it. And is there anything else you'd like to say before we close?
The only thing I'll say is that once you read the book, and I don't think it's going to be that surprising to your listeners, but once you read the book, I think what you'll realize is that you are more responsible for yourself than you might like or want. But sometimes we're responsible for something, not because we're culpable or we're to blame, but because we're the only ones who can change how things are. For several years, when I was a therapist, before I retrained, I was helping girls who had been sexually abused as children by members of their family. And I specialized in treating these girls, young women. They were in college, so I can't really call them girls. From their perspective, in a very real way, they were victimized twice. First, they were victimized by the actual event. Then they were victimized by the realization that they were the only ones to clean up the mess.
Yes.
It was just left to them. But
Yeah.
what other option do you have? So you're more responsible for yourself than you might like, or than it's fair, but only because you're the only one who can really change how things are. And I think what I hope is that this book, this little book, inspires people to understand more about how that works. On the other hand, I also want to say that we are also more responsible for the well-being of other people than we might know or like or want or believe, but it doesn't matter what you believe because biology doesn't care what you believe. It, your brain works the way it works. We live in a culture that privileges individual rights and freedoms, but we have nervous systems that evolved to be socially dependent.
Right.
And that is real. Now, what you decide to do with that is your own business. But you should be aware that, you have an effect on people, and you can decide what kind of an effect do you want to have on people. You're free to do and say, for the most part, what you want, but you are not free from the consequences of what you say and do. And so this sounds really heavy. And in the book, I try to keep things light. I try to tell jokes and, be humorous. But underneath the cool, flashy neuroscience tidbits and underneath some of the joking is a real invitation to people to think about human nature, to use these little nuggets to think about human nature and really think about what kind of a human you want to be.
Yeah, that's an excellent invitation. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. It's really a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest, check the show notes or visit us at www.narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. You can connect with us in many ways. On Instagram, find us under @the NARM Training Institute, on Twitter @NARM Training, and Facebook @NARM Training as well. The NARM Training Institute also offers the Inner Circle, an online self-paced learning program intended for anyone who is interested in joining an international online community focused on healing complex trauma. You can find more information about these trauma-informed learning programs in addition to other resources on the website, www.narmtraining.com. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.